The LA riots are the latest flashpoint in the immigration battle raging in our country today. Can our country survive in any meaningful form with mass immigration? That's what we're going to talk about today on Crisis Point. Hello, I'm Eric Simmons, your host, editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine. As always, before we get started, I want to encourage you to smash that like button, like the looters in LA are smashing the Apple store and Nike store and things like that, because of course somehow that is protesting immigration or immigration control or something like that. Anyway, subscribe to the channel, let other people know about it. You can also go to our website, crisismagazine.com, sign up for our email newsletter, let other people know about it, and you'll get our articles every day, 2 articles a day. Follow us on social media at Crisis Mag. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. So on June 6th, there were some ICE raids in Los Angeles that arrested about 100 people, I think it was. And this somehow set off a protest. I think they started off as protests, they usually do, which quickly descended into riots. And this is interesting because I think it has to do with the fact that it happened in Los Angeles, that it so quickly turned into protests and then riots, because of course Los Angeles actually, right after the election of Donald Trump in this past November 2024, they declared themselves a sanctuary city. And of course there's been no meaningful immigration control in California for, I can't think of the last time I ever heard of them having any meaningful immigration control there. So the idea of ICE agents actually deporting large numbers of immigrants, illegal immigrants, in California, in Los Angeles, that was a spark, I guess, that it needed to have a protest movement against it. Now, I thought was interesting is that Trump very quickly deployed the National Guard. I think this is interesting because we saw in 2020, when the George Floyd protests, which then led to mass destruction and riots and things of that nature. When that occurred, Trump was pretty slow to act on that. I think he did not want to appear to be too authoritarian. He wanted to allow the protests to happen peacefully, as they obviously did not end up being in the end. And I think he probably regrets that. I think he probably wishes that in 2020, he had very quickly moved to stamp out and basically shut down the protests and the riots. And so he deployed the National Guard and the Marines. 2,000 National Guardsmen and 700 Marines were deployed to Los Angeles. And so that, and of course, then Gavin Newsom, the governor of Los Angeles, and the governor of California, and Bass, what's her first name? Karen or something like that. The mayor of Los Angeles, 2 completely worthless Democrats who have done nothing in their terms of office other than just bring about more chaos, more destruction, more economic downturn, and everything that is associated with Democratic politics. But basically, they claim that Trump is inflaming this situation. That was just peaceful protests before Trump came in. And of course, that lie has already been exposed. There were already cars being burned and things like that before Trump, the National Guardsmen, even got there. I also think it's interesting that a number of Waymo cars, the self-driving cars, have been burned. And I was kind of trying to find out, why were they targeted? And I think it was more opportunity than anything else, that these cars just happen to be nearby. They're passive. They're not going to try to get out of a situation, so you can kind of attack them pretty easily. There's no people in them often. And so they get burned very quickly. But I just think that there's a number of questions that arise from these riots, because that's what they are. They're riots. Yes, I'm not saying there aren't protesters involved in the walls, but we saw this at George Floyd, though. I would gather that a lot more people participated in George Floyd-related protests in 2020 than participated in the riots. However, it was kind of the norm that the protests would be in the afternoon, during the daytime, And then at nighttime, the rioters would come out. And I'm not saying there wasn't overlap between the two groups. There obviously is. But the truth is, a lot of the people who are rioting, they don't care that much about making a political statement, about protesting Donald Trump or his immigration policies or anything like that. They're not looting the Apple store because they simply want to, simply because they want to, what am I trying to say? They want to like say, okay, here's the big problem with Donald Trump and his immigration policies. They're like, okay, I can get some free stuff. And the ones who are attacking people or attacking cars, they just like the destruction. They wanted to do it before this, and now they have an excuse to do it. So I really think that's a lot what's going on. I also think the question arises, is this an organic protest movement, or has it been organized? And I think there's a lot of evidence already that it has been organized by certain groups. We saw with the George Floyd protests and riots that wasn't a groundswell from the people, but instead was a real, what am I trying to say? It was really organized by people who wanted to bring chaos, organizations that wanted to bring chaos, undermine the Trump administration. And that's what I think we're seeing here as well. I also think there's a good argument to say, should we treat this like an invasion? After all, when you look at it, a lot of the rioters, they are foreigners flying a foreign flag and attacking American property. Is that not the definition of an invasion? And sometimes they're even attacking American law enforcement and troops. To me, that seems like a definition of an invasion. Now, I'm not saying it's a large-scale invasion, but should they be treated like that? I think, why not? I mean, if they really are coming across the border illegally, and they are flying their foreign flag, the Mexican flag in this case, and they are attacking people and property in America, that sounds like an invasion to me. And so I think they definitely should be treated like that in a lot of these cases. Now, that being said, I do wonder what is the best. I want to talk about in a minute, kind of like more large scale, the immigration issue. But right now, I just kind of address this specific. How do you deal with this situation? How should Donald Trump deal with this situation? I think, first of all, we should be open to the possibility that the federal government should at some point just allow states to burn if they're so poorly managed, and it's kind of like when, I don't like this argument, but I've heard people say that like basically whatever happens in Gaza is their fault because they elected these terrible people, Hamas people. Well, California's been electing some pretty terrible leaders for decades now. Should they just be left to their own devices? Should they just be like, well, this is who you chose to lead you. You chose Gavin Newsom. You just recently chose him in a recall election. You chose the mayor of Los Angeles, who's just a disaster. You keep on choosing these people. Well, this is what happens. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that it impacts the rest of the nation. If California has no real immigration control, it's not like those immigrants can't then go to other states without any problem, because we don't check people at the borders of our states. And economically and other ways, it impacts the entire country. But I've always, and I think people who listen to this podcast for a while know, I've long been an advocate for the possibility of secession. I can't say it, but I advocate for it. Secession. Thank you. There we go. And so we basically say, I basically argue that states should be allowed to secede from the union. I think that's something that is baked into America, who we are. And I think they should be allowed to do that. I'm not saying I think it should be a pretty overwhelming vote by a state in order to do that. But I think it should be allowed. And so if we're getting to the point where certain states are run just so differently, so radically differently than other states, are we really a full union of one country with one set of values, one culture, things like that? And I want to talk about that more in a minute. But does there come a point where the federal government just says, okay, you guys just are going to just destroy yourselves, we're going to let you? I'm not saying they should do that. I'm just saying that that should be part of the conversation of how our if states run themselves into the ground. What is the federal government's, what's the rest of the country's obligation to save them from that? Now, another thing I do want to mention is I think everybody, especially every conservative, should have a somewhat natural aversion to the idea of the federal government sending in troops internally, like the Marines being sent, for example. I think that sets a the precedent's already set, so I shouldn't act like it sets a precedent. It codifies and strengthens a precedent of the government using its military troops against its own citizens. And I think this is something we should not just automatically cheer and say, this is great, this is awesome. I'm not saying there's no cases when we should do this, but long term, that precedent is bad. We've already had the over-militarization of police departments in this country, and now we have the military being used, against the state's wishes. This is the first time, I believe, that the National Guard has been called in to a state without the state wanting them to come. I can't remember. I think since like Selma or something like that in the 1960s. I can't remember the exact date when it happened. It was a long time ago. Because ultimately, in general, ideally, it should work out that the National Guard only comes in by the invitation of the state governor. But of course, in this situation, you have a state governor who's a complete incompetent boob. And so what can you count on for him to do? He's never going to call in the National Guard. He's just going to let everything burn down and get on camera, look pretty, and say, oh, no, everything's fine. We don't have to worry. Everything's going fine. It's Trump's fault or whatever. So I do think there are some issues here that I think we should at least be aware of and not be too quick to just knee jerk and say, yeah, bring the troops in, shut them all down, and all that happening. Now, on general, though, the topic of immigration, what can be done? I've talked about this in the past some before, but it really is an interesting and tricky issue. I do want to say, just to start off, we have been failed by our Catholic leadership massively on this issue. If you look at the bishops, they haven't been terrible on abortion, for example. Yes, they could be stronger in some ways. They're not always great, but they've been pretty consistently pro-life and advocating for life policies at the USCCB level and most individual bishops. But on the issue of immigration, I don't know of a single bishop, maybe Bishop Strickland, I don't know, maybe at one or two, that has actually been good on this issue, or at least been willing to acknowledge that there are two sides of the issue within Catholicism. That's the thing, is they present like the Catholic view is basically de facto open borders. That's what most bishops treat it like. And yet that is obviously not the case. If you read the catechism, you just use some common sense, you know that's not the case. But when I say de facto, what I mean by that is a lot of bishops will give lip service to the idea of securing a border, having some limitations on immigration. But in practice, they have no real practical support for any type of limitations on immigration. When was the last time you heard a bishop say, yes, I support Donald Trump in this specific policy of limiting immigration or of deporting people? Their sole focus has always been, their sole stated focus has always been that we need to minister to the immigrants who are coming to this country, minister to them, realize they have human dignity. All that's true as far as they do with human dignity. But I notice that they never talk about, for example, the fact that maybe we should call on the countries they're coming from to improve. Like, why doesn't a bishop say, hey, why is it Mexico, so many people are fleeing Mexico for America? Why is that? Maybe we should call out Mexico and say, get your act together, get a little better at running your country, and not everybody's going to have to flee. Why don't they contact the Catholic bishops in Mexico and say, hey, why don't you call on your politicians to get their act together, to stop doing things that's leading to so many people immigrating to America? And Mexico is just one country I'm mentioning, but of course, so many countries are like this, where there's not really a call from the Catholic bishops that even bring up this topic, that maybe these other countries need to do a better job. Also, of course, it has to be noted how compromised the bishops are when it comes to immigration because of the vast amounts of money they were receiving for so many years with their immigration services. Now, I don't think, and I've said this before, I don't think the bishops were lining their own pockets, paying for mansions or nice cars or escorts or anything like that, probably male escorts. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that they have for decades, it's been changing recently under Trump, but they've had decades of building up organizations that they support financially, that have lots of employees, a whole bureaucracy behind them, a whole machine. And all of a sudden, they're supposed to speak out against the thing that's funding that's causing all those things to be funded, and cut all that off. And so I really think they're compromised. Even if it's a good bishop who's maybe not bad on immigration, I still think the problem is they come across as very compromised. They have lost their voice. And one of the things I think is the problem with this, with the bishops being so bad on this issue, is they've silenced so many Catholics who instinctively might feel like, yeah, maybe we shouldn't be allowing all these immigrants into the country. But that's not really Catholic to say that, because look what the bishops are saying. I don't think we realize how much that influence the bishops still have with your average pew-sitting Catholic. And so, you see this a lot of times with the kind of the Catholic influencers who are in the establishment track of influencers, meaning they speak at parishes, they speak at diocesan events, they go to these conferences that are endorsed by bishops. They're on bishops, they have bishops on their podcast, stuff like that. They don't want to speak out against immigration because they know that will go badly with the bishops and it might dry up what they're doing. Now, I'm not saying they're all just doing it for money. Don't get me wrong. But I am saying that there's definitely influences there that they might not even realize they're having. They might not even realize that. They're just kind of going along with saying, okay, the Catholic view is we have to support immigration and more open borders. But that's, of course, not true. And so what really Catholics should be talking about and speaking out against is we definitely have to do something about mass immigration. It clearly is a problem in this country. The issue, though, here is it's kind of more clear-cut, frankly, in a lot of European countries than it is here. Because, like, Germany could just say, listen, we're cutting off all immigration. We're Germans. We have a German culture. We have a German nationality, the German people, ethnically German, all that stuff. We're just going to be German. France could do that. Spain could do that. England could do that. But what does it mean to be American? This is where our problem really comes in that I think we have to grapple with. Is I think our foundations, frankly, are very shaky. And they're exposed when it comes to the immigration issue. Because ultimately, what are we? What is America? What is our culture? What is our underlying culture of America? Is it English? Because most of our common law are legal and constitutional setup comes from England. So are we English? Well, the fact is, not that many people in comparison to the whole actually are English. I'm English in my background. I mean, hundreds of years now I've been in America. My family's been in America, but it came directly from England. But I know lots and lots of people, who are Germans, who are French, who are Russian, who are, lots of different Italian, whatever the case may be. That's their background. And they're here in America and they've been here for generations. And of course, then you have the large number of people who came here from Africa against their will. And now their descendants are in this country. So are we going to say that the American culture is English? Is it English and African and German. And I mean, here in Cincinnati, our two biggest immigrant communities historically, not recently, historically, have been German and Irish. Now, Germany and Ireland are obviously more similar to each other than, for example, England and Somalia. But Germany and Ireland are very different in a lot of ways. So, which culture is it? And that's where I think we really, like I said, the immigration crisis is exposing America's shaky foundations. What is American culture? What is it? What does it mean to be American? We've been told, we've been brainwashed that means diversity, unity and diversity. But that's just not, that's not a foundation that is set for success. That's just code words and slogans that mean nothing, that will not lead to a long-term strong society. And we've seen by the fact that things are falling apart. We've taken diversity so far that basically we are unwilling to speak out against any culture, no matter what, if it's no matter what, even if it's very destructive and awful. And so I really think when it comes to immigration, it's like the first step is taking care of immigration, but then the second step is, what do we do after we've kind of taken care of immigration? How do we control it? Because so obviously you have to secure the border. I think politically that is very popular. Most people will support the idea of you secure the border and you don't let people in illegally. I also think we need to deport as many illegal immigrants as possible. But I think politically you have to start with the criminals. I mean, the criminals beyond just those who are here illegally. Obviously, anybody who breaks the law to come here is technically a criminal. But the fact is, I don't think there's widespread political support for deporting every single illegal immigrant in this country. So start with the ones who have committed crimes in this country since they've arrived here. That obviously be, very politically popular. And I do think, though, we need to go deeper than that. We do need to go deeper and start and try to deport as many illegal immigrants as possible. Now, the fact is there will be consequences that. I do think it will impact the economy. I do think our economy is influenced a lot by illegal immigrants working here. I think that's just simply a fact of life. And I think, though, however, the truth is, personally, I'm okay with that. Because, yes, there are benefits to having illegal immigrants in this country, a large number of illegal immigrants, mostly economic. But there are obviously negatives. There's costs involved. And in my mind, the cost has gone greater than the benefits. And so if it means that economically it's going to hurt us some, I think that's less important than the cultural impact. I also think I personally have no problem if they just simply said we're going to halt all immigration temporarily. Like literally nobody is allowed to immigrate to this country for, let's say, for the next year, and just start with that. And I think that if that happens, what that does is it gives us a breather. It gives time for assimilation, for an establishment of a stronger culture, so that you can then open up immigration limited and only when it's allowed in certain circumstances. But the truth is that's never going to happen. I mean, it's just not going to happen in America without some massive black swan event or some miracle. It just isn't going to happen. There's just not the political support for it in this country. So I think what we do is we support anything that limits immigration as much as possible. Now, here's where it gets politically dicey. The politically incorrect thing to say is, I think that the immigration, I think this is a very Catholic view of it. I think that the immigration should preference certain countries over others, certain cultures over others. Now, as soon as you say this, I know what happens. You get called a racist. That's the term you throw out there to try to shut somebody up. But who cares? That's ridiculous. But the fact is, it comes back to us talking about what is our culture in America? What is the baseline, so to speak? Like, I know, for example, if you drop 10,000 Somalians in a small town in Ohio, that's a recipe for disaster, and I don't want that. However, if you drop, let's say, 10,000 native Irishmen in, I don't know, Kansas City, I don't see that as much of a problem. I don't see that, and potentially it'd be a good, because the reality is the culture is different. It's just simply the way it is. And when I talk about culture, a lot of this has to do not with race, but with religion. What is the basis of European culture? It's Christianity. Whether or not it's become Protestant or not, or Anglican or whatever, or if it's stayed Catholic, it's ultimately Christendom. It's Christianity. And that ultimately needs to be the unifying force in our country. The culture, the American culture must be Christian. Now, obviously, the ideal is that it's Catholic. Heck, go even further. It's a Catholic monarchy. But the idea of a Catholic monarchy in America is not happening in my lifetime or yours. But if we can reestablish a Christian basis where we say, yes, a country that is predominantly Muslim, no, we won't allow immigration from there. Just we won't. If it's a predominantly Muslim country, maybe we even say we just won't allow Muslims into the country. That got Trump in so much trouble back in 2016 when he didn't even say that, but he was accused of saying that. I'll just say it. Don't allow Muslims into the country. Anybody who comes and they're Muslim, they're not allowed in. Because I think ultimately, when you open up the borders and you don't have these barriers, you don't have these restrictions and guidelines for who gets allowed in, you get the chaos we see today. You get the chaos of multiculturalism, which is a lie. The fact is, culture is how we live. It's what we believe. And if two cultures are diametrically opposed to each other, like a Christian culture and a Muslim culture, then it's not going to work out. One of them will win out. Or actually, I should say this. Either Christianity, the Christian culture will win out, or the Muslim culture will win out, or a secular culture will win out. Because that's what we've actually seen in America is the secular culture wins out because they just like, oh, forget it. We're going to base our culture on a lowest common denominator, which is like being human or something stupid like that. Instead of saying, okay, it needs to be based upon some reality, some truth about who we are as human persons. And so I would just say that, like I said, we're not going to cut out all immigration. I think that'd be good to do temporarily. I do think, by the way, I'm not a proponent of cutting all immigration out, halting all immigration forever. I think that's a stupid policy. But I do think temporarily there's nothing wrong with it. But even if we don't do that, and like I said, I don't think we will, let's limit who's allowed in here. Let's limit who is allowed in here. Now, of course, I don't think with my crowd, it's very controversial to say we shouldn't allow Muslims in. But what about people from India? I think that's where the real controversy arises because you have people like Vivek Ramaswamy, who I like and I'm supporting for governor of Ohio next year, and people I bet you like J.D. Vance, people like that, who would support intelligent people coming from like high-tech workers coming into our country. I think we should pause that, by the way. I think that it's very plausible. I think it's a plausible argument, the idea that Indian like high-tech workers are doing a better job than many American workers at the same job. But I don't think we can really know that until you say, okay, let's just stop letting Indians in and let's see if Americans step up. Because I personally think Americans would step up in that case. Like, I think it's probably true that if you look at the average, the Indian workers in the tech field, they probably are better, smarter, and harder work and all that stuff than the average American workers. But does that mean, that is true no matter what? I think it's more a matter of if we halted it, what would happen then? So I think that's kind of those are the type of things I think we should discuss, because personally, the Indian one is, I think, the more difficult one because of the fact that their culture is not like ours. I know this. I've worked with Indians in the past in the tech field, and their culture is not like ours. There's just no other way you can say it than that. And so, but at the same time, I found Indian workers to be very good in a lot of ways and getting a lot done. And so I think there is a debate to be had there. But honestly, somebody who's like from a country like Somalia or something like that, Muslims, young men coming in, nope, just don't let them in. And does that mean every single one of them is a potential terrorist? No, I don't think that. And in fact, I think there's been Muslim immigrants who've come to this country who've worked out fine. They didn't cause any problems. They paid their taxes. They raised their kids and all that stuff. But on a whole, it just still undermines the Christian culture here. And that's just the reality. It still undermines the Christian culture here. And so the problem, of course, is we've abandoned Christianity for secularism. So we'd have to reestablish that. So I do think that there's a lot of good debate to be had among Catholics when it comes to immigration. But to me, you can't start the conversation unless you've established some things like, okay, we just need to secure our border. We need to get rid of, deport all the illegal immigrants we can. And we need to significantly reduce the amount of illegal immigration allowed right now. I mean, yes, to zero would be great temporarily, but like just significantly reduce it. That's like the starting point to, I think, a legitimate conversation then to, okay, now that that's happened, who do we let in? Who do we let in? Do we let in, maybe there's a famine in Ireland. Do we let in the Irish, some of them, if they're suffering? Do we let in Mexicans? I mean, Mexican is traditionally a Catholic country. Do we let in Mexicans? Cubans, there's a good example of strong. I have a son-in-law who's Cuban. He didn't immigrate himself, but his family did a couple of generations before him. I don't want him to go. And I know they bring a lot. They brought a lot. The Cuban Catholics have brought a lot to this country. So I think there's discussions to be had there. I don't think it's just a matter of, okay, don't let anybody in ever, or only let in white Europeans. I don't think that's an answer either. But I do think, yeah, don't let in the Muslims. Sure, I think that's a good one. Don't let, obviously, any criminals in, things like that. So that, I think, is the conversation. But I think ultimately what we really need to be focused on is reestablishing a Christian culture in America. Obviously, our ultimate goal would be a Catholic culture, maybe a monarchy. But for now, it's got to be a Christian culture in America, because that's the basis. And you can't have that if you're allowing millions and millions of people who aren't Christian into this country. I mean, that's just the way it is. Okay, let me check out some of the live chat here. I got to put on my glasses to see these because I'm an old man. Actually, it doesn't help. I'm just going to squint. Okay, so let me pull up here. August TV 123 says, sadly, most of our bishops are terrible at properly articulating the Catholic view on unfettered immigration. Yeah, they just aren't good at this. And I think it's because, honestly, they've been compromised. And when I say that, I'm not saying it's always corruption. There is corruption among the bishops. Compromise is the better word, in the sense that they've just been neutered. It's very difficult for them to really come out strongly against immigration in this country, because of the fact that all their brother bishops are on board with open borders in practice, and there's millions of dollars at stake. So, and lots of employees, things like that. Sazan, is it? PV says, is voting secure? I'm in California. I don't trust the vote counts. Well, you might be right. I mean, I can't speak to that, but I just know that, I'm sorry, but in California, you keep voting for terrible politicians. And so you kind of get what you deserve. If they're cheating, that's another thing. And there should be maybe an investigation of that. But right now, it doesn't look good for California. TK O'Rourke says, so many people comment on YouTube videos about why people are waving Mexican flags at these protests if they don't want to go back there. It's because they want to turn California back to Mexico. That's a great point, TK. In fact, I even heard some commentator on CNN. I don't listen to CNN. Don't worry. I haven't gone crazy. But I saw a clip of it online where she was basically saying, like, well, California was always part of Mexico, so this is really just legitimate, which, of course, is ludicrous. It goes back to the liberal history lessons that, like, somehow borders that one country taking over another country 500 years ago, in some cases it's wrong, but in other cases it's okay, depending on whether we like them now. I mean, that's essentially what they do. And that is true. They want to turn California into part of Mexico, like basically like Mexico. Well, you see, why is everybody leaving Mexico, though? Because it's poorly run. And that's exactly what California is trying to imitate. Okay, so Zon PV says Cincinnati demographics: white alone, 46%, black 40%, Native American, and everybody else low. And that sounds about right. But I don't know where you got that stat from. But remember, if we're talking the city or if we're talking the entire like greater Cincinnati area, and this is the case with any city, what are the demographics? I do know that Cincinnati has been taken over by leftist blue politicians, and it's a disaster. There was a tragedy just last week in a neighborhood my own parish is in, where a owner of a business, local business, was murdered in a failed robbery, and the owner of the business was white, and the killer, the alleged killer, was black. And it just, there hasn't been any riots about that though. But we know for a fact if the races were reversed, there'd be riots. But there was nothing for this. It barely even it didn't even really make national news. Okay, Dustin says, you bring in people that admire the nation because of the opportunity it gives, not people that have animosity against it. That's a good general principle. And like, it's kind of like, okay, that's why I'm more open than a lot of conservatives are to, for example, Indian tech workers coming over. If they're coming over and they're like, hey, I want to get a good job here, this is where the best jobs are, and I can get a good job here, I can support my family, I can contribute to the country, I can be a good citizen, I'm more open to that. Now, like I said, there's still the cultural issue that I have a real problem with. And if I'm going to limit immigration a lot, I'm favoring people from a Christian culture over people from a non-Christian culture. But the general principle of it is, why are they coming over here? Are they coming over here because they basically want to take advantage, they know they got a free ride here, or because they want to improve and love our country? I think that's a good basic question. Gus TV 123 says, some people get really animated about the Boer immigrants, but if they were dropped right into my small rural town, we'd hardly notice. So I think, it is interesting because that's the thing. It's cultural. Like I said, I use the example of Somalians being dropped into a town, a small rural town in Ohio, because the cultures are going to clash. And that is not racist to say that. That is not racist to just simply acknowledge that the way they live is very different than the way we live. I mean, the whole truth is Christians spent over 1,000 years building up Christendom. And they did that because they knew how important culture is. They knew that that is the baseline that allows people to live authentically the gospel, to discover Jesus Christ, and to follow him. Without the culture, I'm not saying people don't become Catholic. Obviously, the early church, they had anti-Christian culture. They became Catholic. People still do it today in our culture. But a truly Christian culture does give you a better ability to spread the gospel and for people to accept it and to live more moral lives. And so there's nothing wrong. There's nothing non-Catholic or against the church's teaching to say, hey, we want a Christian culture here. And so we're only going to allow in immigrants who will abide and follow that Christian culture, no matter what country they come from. If they abide by that Christian culture and they support it and they endorse it, then I'm more open to letting them in. There still should be limits. I'm not saying you let everybody in, but there still should be limits. But they're the ones I want to favor over, okay, they're like from Somalia or some Muslim country, or even from India or something like that. I would favor somebody who's a practicing Christian, no matter what country they're from, Mexico, Ireland, England, somewhere in South America, or Africa, or wherever. If they're a practicing Christian, I'm going to favor them over a Muslim from anywhere, or maybe a very impressive Indian who's not Christian as well. So I think that's the type of things I think Catholics really need to be more open about, just expressing that this is important, our culture is important, it's worth trying to restore, because we have lost it, restore our Christian culture here in America. Because otherwise, we're just not America anymore. We're just some Muslim or whatever countries we'll end up being. So, okay, I'm gonna stop it there. I appreciate you all tuning in today. Until next time, everybody, God love you.